So, I mean, one of the things I'm really struck with that all of you are dealing with is the scale of what you're talking about and the difference in scale. I mean, it's affecting local communities on the scale of the ground truth or the Corona sites. This is obviously a national issue as well. It's an international issue. It's a global issue. It's a space issue. So I'm wondering, in your work, how you manage some of that sort of those issues of scale as you're discussing the work and as you're bringing it to audiences in terms of translating and making accessible those kinds of complexities.
Right. So I can tell you that I interface with quite a profile of different communities. You know, when I go to the United Nations, the Committee on Peaceful Use of Outer Space every June in Vienna, that is very high level chit chat, and it's trying to make sure that I'm not pushing any sort of cultural bias from the U.S. and forcing U.S. perspectives down other people's throats, kind of trying to be open-minded that way. But I also have colleagues, scientists and engineers who say, oh, you know, why do you, man, you can get on a subway and you start talking to people about space traffic. Like, why do you do that? Like, those are lay people. Like, why do they, it's like, it's everybody's issue, right? And so I try to come up with analogies that people can actually wrap their brains around, and not everything has to be technical and about equations, that sort of. It's definitely a challenge to be able to do that sort of thing and kind of get that message across and try to be a bridge and unite kind of the community writ large that way.
Well, I think when I talked to communities in this book I wrote, The Final Mission, what we found out was that every state in the Union had a part in putting those guys on the moon. And there are local communities, like the community of Casa Grande and White Sands, who were involved in space exploration. And I try to make people aware of the fact that, for me, going into space is such an extraordinary trip, and it's such an extraordinary amount of technology to get there, that we should make young people aware that it's not all solved yet. There's so much other stuff to learn, but that we should value in our own communities how we participated in it. You know, how we, I had a student one time bring me a bolt. She had this little bolt. She came out and she says, my dad made this. And I said, well, that's nice. And she said, yeah, he worked in Massachusetts, and he created this bolt that went on the capsule of Apollo 11. It wasn't the original one from the bolt, but he made this. And so he had a connection to that. And I think when we connect to this extraordinary part of humanity on a one-to-one basis, on a local level, then we can value it. And then we can make good decisions about what to preserve and what not, and what's safe and what isn't.
Yeah, sure. I'll just add a few thoughts. You know, in terms of that question of scale, it's for us in our image making, luckily, we have kind of a predetermined scale that we're working in, this, you know, 60-mile square grid, and it's so determined, but still really expansive for the type of work that we're doing. So, so you know, I mean, if we do end up going to all these sites and photographing them, I'm sure we have probably the next 10 years of our lives wrapped up in that process, and it remains to be seen whether that's what the next 10 years look like. But yeah, again, the idea of scale, thankfully we're only working with a subset of those black marks, and even that feels really, you know, overwhelming. But I think that's one of the things about the visual medium photography that is really powerful, because it allows you to kind of see that and experience that in a real visceral way. And so, you know, that kind of the density, even though it maybe doesn't have a number, or you don't even need to read the labels, there's still a sort of sense of what that is.
Yeah, so one of the things that I want to just bring up that I see as a big problem in being able to communicate and get people engaged and that sort of thing is that we still idolize space as a domain. And so we still talk about it. It's not a place where we really interact much. It's something that's kind of far away. It's not something that is that accessible to us, to most people. And it's only for smart people. Only smart people should get involved in any sort of work with space. And you need to, have this IQ or go to that school or that. And that's almost like saying, oh, well, pick another domain, maritime. Only smart people should get in a boat and be at sea. No, we don't do that with other domains. We need to normalize space. If we want to do the things that you're talking about and that sort of stuff, it can't be this exotic, oh my goodness, I got to touch the hand of Buzz Aldrin. It's like, listen, the guy's amazing. I've met the guy several times. I'm not going to take anything away from him because certainly I've not been to the moon. But at the same time, we keep on having NASA groupies and these. If we keep on doing that, it's going to be to our detriment. We need to make space just another domain, a normal, we do business as usual here. And in that measure, I think more people can get involved and we can start solving some of these issues.
So we are in the Center for Creative Photography having this conversation. So I do want to bring in aesthetics and photography in a sort of direct way as well before we open it up for questions. And so I'm going to move from this very large sense of scale down to something very small. And I actually wanted just to ask you. I mean, one of the objects on the moon is a photograph, right? Can you talk about that a little bit from your perspective?
Well, you're going to show my ignorance because it's not from 11. I believe it's from 14. Does somebody want to correct me? It was it's in a one of those little plastic bags, sealed zip. John, do you remember who it is? And it's a guy. It's an astronaut and his family, and he put it up there. There's a golf ball. There are also things like emesis bags. Those are throw-up bags, and pee-pee bags, urine bags on the moon. Because when they on 11, when they told them to jettison anything that wasn't important, that went out. Now, aesthetically, that's not too pleasing, but if you've seen one of the urine bags, which I've seen in a model in Smithsonian, it's a very complicated thing, and it's part of the technology that allowed humans to go to the moon. So there's a lot of stuff up there. When I tell people it's over 200 tons, that's a lot of material culture, and that's just the moon. We've got stuff on Mars, Venus. I think it blew up, it burnt up. So there are many. Everybody always says, "What's your favorite object?" Well, I don't have one, but there's a lot of stuff up there.
Damon, I want to ask you about some of the aesthetic choices that you and Julie made as you're taking your photographs, because of course there's a very specific place you have to be, but as any photographer knows, even if you're at one very specific place, there are still sort of infinite number, maybe not infinite, there are a large range of kinds of photographs you could actually make, and you talked about this a little bit with the overcast sky. And I thought about this as you were showing, the couple of them have really beautiful sunsets, right? And the degree, I'm curious about the degree to which you and Julie talk about or try to frame a perception of the issues that you're talking about through the aesthetics of your image.
Yeah, I mean, I think we use some sort of standards in terms of the distance and the height, but it's also really kind of important for us to be able to make those kind of creative and aesthetic decisions. And I mean, we have to travel like hour or hour and a half just to get to one of these. So, there's a certain sort of just finding time determines, what the images look like to a certain extent. But I mean, I think the most important decisions are sort of in that, in that circle, choosing how we sort of frame that mark and what's in the background so that we can, sort of engage the history of the place, and also sort of ensure that we are kind of illustrating some sense of variety in terms of what our experience has been in these locations. So I mean, I think we try to give ourselves certain constraints, but also leave enough room to make some of those kind of aesthetic decisions.
Are there questions from the audience?
So first, I'd like to thank you all for your extraordinary speeches. Thank you. My question is directed towards Damon, and going back to aesthetics, I'm curious as to why you chose to do all your photos in the morning as opposed to using the night sky.
Well, you said in the morning?
Meaning in the daytime.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so I mean, the images are throughout the day. We have some very early and some late, but it's mostly the technology that determines that, because you know, the equipment that we're using, and also just the nature of having the camera up that high in the air, we would have a really difficult time making an exposure, a sharp image. So we're stuck with daylight. I mean, we have some, I think, you know, if we had no limitation in terms of equipment and budget, and you know, and we're able to make some images at night, I'm sure we would be doing that. But we do have those limitations, unfortunately. So, but we have been talking about some kind of sort of parallel projects that we could kind of extend into the night sky as well.
Other questions?
Can you hear me?
Use your teacher voice.
Yeah, I'll use my teacher voice. I'm really interested in temporality, and this is a piece I kind of was, maybe I'm projecting onto what you were talking about, but I saw this as kind of the absent piece in all three. When you talk about photons and you talk about gravity, this is not something frozen in time, it's constantly in motion. And then I was thinking about archaeology and how you look at the status of an object from the past, and yet each day in the life of that object, it's ongoing, decay is ongoing. And so at what moment do you decide we're freezing that for preservation? Which historical moment, in other words, this is a classic problem for archaeology, I know. But given that it's space, and given that you mentioned that one of your objects on the moon is billions of years old, I was thinking about billions of years and motion and gravity. And then I was thinking about the superimposed map on the images that Damon was sharing with us, and I thought that shows you the map on which day, in other words, which orbits of the satellites are being mapped. And then I thought they also don't show all the space debris and the decay of the space debris, which is constant. So my big question for all of you is, how do you account for temporality?
Yeah, so no, thank you for that. That's exactly right. I mean, basically, you know, I just like with the Space Surveillance Telescope, I just showed you kind of a snapshot of a very small interval. All these things are moving. Now, in hindsight, I should have shown you a movie of all these things so that you could get some perspective on all this. But yeah, as my title implies, astrodynamics, it's dynamic. It's not astrostatics. And so absolutely, it's all moving. And I want to actually start talking at some point about satellite gerontology, about how these things age, and heard it here first, right? Okay.
Well, one of the things that archaeologists look at, and Mike Schiffer really started this, is the life history of an artifact. And it's created, it has a purpose, and then it's defunct. It becomes debris, and that's the stuff we love. So it's temporarily, to look at time as an archaeologist, I'm of the opinion that archaeologists, our lives submit to archaeology. So we're sitting here with artifacts and jewelry and shoes and everything else. And as archaeologists, we can study those almost to the present time. So it's interesting in space, like Vanguard. God knows when it's coming down. It will eventually come down, and when it comes down, it's over. There's no artifacts. Well, I guess it goes into the ocean. I don't know what happens to it. Yeah, somebody could go grab it, but they don't seem really hip on doing this. But it's still an interesting idea of this thing from 1958, and it still has meaning today, even though it's doing nothing, you know. I read a recent article about, is it called Point Nemo? It's where all these things go to die, you know, like the Mir space station and the ocean, and like there's tons of junk in there, and they just keep throwing it in there. So what's important, and what is really debris, and we don't need it, and it's not significant, and we also can't preserve it for various different physical and environmental reasons.
It seems like that problem of categorization is so, we have all these systems with our material culture here on Earth of what to do with them, right? We throw things in the trash and they go to the landfill and then they're junk, and that's a separate problem, of course, or we put them in museums and we care for them and we keep them for a long period of time. But you know, you've all talked about this sort of problem of, you know, regulation and finding categories and ways to manage. You know, nobody owns the heavens, but they need to be managed still. Somebody has to kind of step up. So, I mean, that's not really a question, maybe more of just an observation or making a, yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so one thing that I find quite interesting is that anything that is in that catalog or database of things that you plotted, in order for it to be in that catalog, it needs to have a country of origin ascribed to it. And once it has a country of origin ascribed to it, that country is the sovereign owner of that piece of junk. And so if China were to go to Vanguard, that would be bad news, because the US would not like that, and US can't go to a Chinese piece of debris or artifact. And so that complicates that sort of landscape a bit.
I mean, just to get back to that question, I thought that was a really, really wonderful question that sort of, you know, was open and sort of drew in all of what we were talking about. Just to kind of talk about that idea of temporality in terms of our images, we, you know, I mean, there are these cement marks on the ground, so there's, you know, not much that changes when we go back and visit a site. Of course, everything behind it and around it can change. But the other thing is that it's always kind of this, you know, kind of discovery when we commit to making an image. You know, we've done enough of them that we have some very, very rough idea of what the satellite map might look like, but it's always, you know, really kind of exciting to see, to sort of slowly uncover what was in the sky, you know, piece by piece. And so, you know, I like to think about them as kind of fingerprints each time it's building this map that's going to be slightly different depending on all those factors.
One thing that I find interesting when I look at that map is that when I lived on Maui working for the Air Force Research Lab there was a rise in shark attacks. And so the mayor of Maui County said, you know, this is not so good for tourism. We're going to tag sharks and we're going to track them. We're going to do this really awesome thing. We're going to put a website up and we're just going to show where all these sharks are at. Except that there's no, as you said, temporality with that map, and it's static. And so basically it shows that the Maui waters are saturated with sharks. It's like you look at that map and like, I don't even want to put my toe in the water because it's going to get bitten off. But clearly that doesn't show how those sharks migrate and that sort of thing, right? And so maybe one of the things that, I don't know, I mean, I'm not an artiste, so I'm just going to put this out there, brother, but maybe one of the things that you could do to incorporate that is maybe have some shading, right? It's like blue is at the beginning of the time, red as time progresses, so that you can kind of get that idea of this. Even though there's no motion in the picture, it conveys motion, just because you're, anyway.
Bad idea.
I won't ask you for royalties, man, if you do.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Hi, Thanks for all your talk. So I had a question that was maybe kind of related to the previous one, which is that I started thinking about permanence, especially when I saw Damon's photographs of the concrete marks and how some of them are beginning to decay. And then obviously Beth's work deals with permanence at a great level. And then Moriba was also talking about, satellites have finite lifetimes. Satellites can run into things. They can decay. They can fall out of the sky. But you might also be familiar with Trevor Paglen's work, where he's mentioned that the geostationary belt of satellites is, lasts essentially forever if the satellite's batteries don't explode, and in some senses are, potentially one of our longest-lasting cultural works. But then knowing everything, this is also something that came up in all of your work, that knowing about these things and trying to preserve them, you're also faced with dealing with secrecy. And both state and commercial actors have interest in not telling you everything that's going on, like the origin of the concrete marks and then many other things like that Kh4 camera. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about its role in what you're doing.
Yeah, my colleague Wayne Donaldson, who is the head of the advisory council, who was the California SHPO, has a really good point. When people think of archaeology and preservation, they think of beautiful adobe houses and haciendas and, aesthetically pleasing things. They don't think of a rocket test launch site. And many of these places where space exploration happened are on military bases, and they're restricted. You've got to be escorted or have a reason to go out there. So the public doesn't interact too much. I mean, you could go to, Cape Canaveral and Kennedy Space Center and see stuff. But the fact is that there are myriad of places that are secret, like the Corona, and then there are commercial secrets that are in existence now. And I don't know which is worse, the military secrets or the commercial stuff, because in both cases they're doing something and we're watching a development in engineering or whatever technology, but we can't know about it until it's over, So we don't even know about Corona, and it's really hard to find out anything about these marks. They show pictures of the Soviet Union. They have everything revealed. Al Gore, said, okay, everything's going to be revealed. Well, it ain't. And I'm going to be talking to the NRO in April. And one of my friends said, they'll love this stuff. They probably don't even know these calibration marks exist because it's been buried and hidden somewhere.
They'll probably show you photographs of you next to the ones before you even. You want to say? Yeah, I don't want to say anything.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the satellites, we're just working off of these open databases, so we have no idea of what secret objects exist. But in terms of the marks, there are a lot of restrictions. I mean, there's probably about maybe even over, I forget the count, but over a third that's on tribal land on the Tohono O'odham Nation reservation, and there's a lot that are just restricted by the city or private property. So I mean, we've been working on this for quite a while, but we've only been to like 30 or 40 of these sites, and they're all ones that are pretty easily accessible. So I don't know what the future holds, but if we do continue with this, there's going to be much more kind of